This weekend, I moved my daughter Leela down to Charlottesville, Virginia, where on Monday morning she will begin a new job at the University of Virginia. We drove down to Charlottesville on Friday morning, and after arriving and unpacking, we had time to look around the town. I'd never been to Charlottesville before, except for one brief visit a number of years ago, and I was interested in seeing what the town was like, particularly in light of all the news about Charlottesville that has been in the press for the past month or so. And I was very pleased with what I saw. It seemed to be a very nice college town with a great deal of things to do, the kind of things that young people like to do. So I felt good about leaving Leela there yesterday morning and coming back to Philadelphia and Alan's and my second version of the empty nest. And I couldn't help, frankly, but compare Leela's experience in moving from Philadelphia to Charlottesville with my own experience many years ago when, after finishing seminary, I moved from Boston, Massachusetts to Cookeville, Tennessee. Cookeville, Tennessee is a small town. It was even smaller then than it is today. It's about halfway between Nashville and Knoxville along Interstate 40. And it's not exactly Charlottesville, Virginia. In fact, when I moved there, there was very little of the sort of thing that young people like to do, and back then, I was actually a young person. And it felt, frankly, a little like moving to Siberia. And I struggled with that for some time. But eventually, I settled in and found living and working there in Cookeville to have been a very good experience. I learned a lot working in a setting that I was not used to ever having lived in. And frankly, I think every pastor should at some point in their career, hopefully early on, have the chance to work in a very different environment from what you're used to, because it teaches you a lot about how people are wherever you find them. And that's something that is very useful for any pastor to learn. Among my fondest memories of the 5 years I spent in Cookeville were friendships with a couple of other ministers in town. One, pastor of a small Disciples of Christ church who was only a few years older than I was, though he was not yet finished with seminary and was attending Vanderbilt Divinity School and commuting back and forth between Cookeville and Nashville. The other was the pastor of a large Methodist church in town. He was considerably older. I thought at the time he was very old, though I doubt he was as old as I am now. But he was in the last few years of his pastoral career and was looking to retire in just a short while. The three of us used to get together every Tuesday morning, very early, 7 o'clock, something like that, and we would discuss the lectionary text for the coming Sunday, talk about what we saw in the text, what we thought we might do in our sermons, that sort of thing. And afterward, we would go to breakfast, and we would talk about all kinds of things, stuff in our own churches that we really weren't free to talk about with anybody in the church. And so it was very helpful to have that support group in a setting like that. And at the time, I was only 30 years old at the time, I just assumed that I would have that kind of group wherever I went. That the next place I went, I'd find friends like that with whom I could share that kind of collegiality. And the fact is, I never again found those people. which is just a reminder to you to always appreciate the blessings when they occur and never ever take them for granted and just assume that you're always going to have them. Well, it was one of those Tuesday mornings that we were discussing our lessons, and those lessons just so happened to be the very lessons we have read today in church, which allows me to say exactly when it was. It was the fall of 1984. And the lessons that day really struck me, one in particular, and it was the reading from Exodus. And not just the passage in Exodus 14 that Emily read this morning, but the continuation of that story into chapter 15. Now, if you remember the reading, the Israelites have just crossed the sea safely, while the Egyptian army that was pursuing them had been destroyed. If you remember the story, a strong east wind blew and pushed the waters off the sea, leaving dry ground. I don't know how many of you were watching the Weather Channel like I was last weekend and saw what happened in Tampa Bay. Any of you remember that? Tampa Bay, which is a large body of water, was very nearly emptied of water by a strong east wind, which pushed all of the water away out into the Gulf. And for a while, you could walk along the sand way out beyond the normal coastline. Well, you could walk out there. What you couldn't have done is drive a chariot through that wet sand. And that's exactly what's being described here in this passage from Exodus. And then, as the Israelites stand upon the shore after the water has swept in and swept away all of the chariots that got stuck in the mud, the Israelites sang a song. And that song is chapter 15. And there's one verse in particular in that song that really hit me and caused me to think about it that day and ever since. And that verse is, with the Israelites standing on the shore, Miriam, the prophet, the sister of Aaron, and also Moses, is said to have taken a tambourine and sang a song to the Lord. And that song began with these words, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." There was something about that verse that really hit me. Now, one of the very interesting things, if you read a commentary on this verse, is that this verse is believed to be among the oldest verses in the Bible. A verse that goes back farther than almost anything else, perhaps than anything else. Now, of course, there are accounts of events that took place before this, but those were all thought to have been written much later, that this is a verse that goes back to that very time. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. And if in fact that is among the oldest verses, it's almost as if this verse were the seed from which the faith of Israel would grow. Think about that. But the other thing that struck me about the verse that day is what Miriam says. She says, the horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. The horse and its rider. As if there were only one, which we know clearly was not the case, because there were lots of horses and lots of chariots. So why say the horse and its rider? Most translations, in fact, change that. The NRSV that we read here at church, the Pew Bibles, if you look up this verse, it says horse and rider as a way of including all of them. But that's not what the Hebrew says. It says the horse and its rider. And the more I thought about that verse, the more it dawned on me that Miriam really wasn't talking about the Egyptians, at least not just about the Egyptians. That Miriam was talking about something else, something bigger, something more threatening. And I remember what I said that morning when I explained this idea to my friends. I said, do you know what Miriam was talking about, who she was talking about? They said, who? I said, she's talking about Darth Vader. Now, of course, I didn't mean that literally. Miriam didn't know who Darth Vader was. But what Darth Vader is in the Star Wars epic is what Miriam was talking about. It is the power of which we are afraid. The force that makes us think that death has the final word. The fear that holds us in its grip and sucks the life out of us. That fear, everything we're afraid of. For the Israelites, it had been the Egyptians for all those years that they were held in slavery. But there, beside the sea, Miriam celebrated that they didn't need any longer to be afraid because the horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. You know, I don't think you and I appreciate the extent to which fear still rules our world. We all live lives of relative safety and security. We don't get up in the morning fearful of what might happen to us that day. I get up in the morning and worry about driving on the Schuylkill Expressway. And it's easy to forget how many people in this world live with fear constantly as a force, as a power in their lives. How many people in how many places in this world don't know where their next meal is going to come from, what their children are going to eat that very day? People in so many places in this world who fear disease, the threat of disease, striking them and their family, especially their children. Do you have any idea how many children die every year in Africa from malaria, which often kills its victims within a day? Do you have any idea what it's like to wake up in the morning and not know if your children will make it through that day? How many people live like that? Do you know how many people live in places where war is endemic, where conflict never ceases, and where you never know when a battle of firefight is going to break out in your community without any notice or warning at all? Can you imagine what that's like? It's clearly enough to convince people to try to cross oceans in rubber rafts because of the power of fear, the fear of death, and the fear that death is the last word. And when you think about people living with that, think about what a difference a word of hope can bring. How much difference the good news that there is hope, how much difference that can make in people's lives. And when there are those who have heard the good news, those who have reason to be hopeful, those who are confident of their safety and security in the Lord their God, when those who have that good news and for whatever reason do not share it with others who so desperately need it, then they are no different, no better than the slave in the parable who, having received his Lord's mercy, his Lord's enormous mercy, could not be bothered to share even a fraction of that mercy with a fellow slave. We are no better than that. And we should hear in this parable, then, a warning that we should never forget that it is not our efforts, the strength of our arm, to use the phrase from Exodus, that has gained us our safety and security. It is the Lord. It is the Lord who has triumphed gloriously. It is the Lord who horse and its rider has thrown into the sea. That is the good news of the gospel. That death is not the final word, that death is never the final word, that death has been destroyed. And that is the good news. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor now and forevermore.